So it is time for the press preview then, a first look at what is on tomorrow's front pages. And tonight we'll check out the headlines with the Daily Mirror columnist Susie Boniface and the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. Susie, at least in the festive spirit. Henry, got a bit of catching up to do. We'll speak to him in a moment after we've had a look at the front pages, starting with the Eye. A constitutional clash could be in the offing as politicians in Westminster consider blocking new legislation already passed in Scotland that would let people change their legally recognised gender from the age of 16. The Telegraph cites the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer's approval of the measures, while the Times says the government is looking at ways to encourage older people who may have taken early retirement back into the workforce. The Financial Times hears that in the first 20 days of December alone, China has reported 250 million COVID cases, amounting to nearly a fifth of its population. The Mail criticises the funding that goes towards equality and diversity measures in the NHS. The Mirror previews the King's first Christmas speech, in which, as one might expect, he pays tribute to his late mother, while the Express says he'll pledge to build on her legacy of more than 7 decades on the throne. The Sun claims His Majesty will no longer be letting Prince Andrew keep an office at Buckingham Palace. And the Star says that, for some reason, Russian cyber hackers have their sights set on the graffiti artist Banksy. And don't forget, by scanning the QR code you can see on screen throughout the programme, you can take a look at tomorrow's front pages while you watch us discussing them. And, as I say, we're joined tonight by Susie Boniface and Henry Hill. Great to see you. Lots to talk about then. Often the papers are a bit thin this close to Christmas, but actually there is a lot to discuss, Susie, starting with this story on the front of the Mail, a mindfulness lead to help NHS staff mediate. Is being advertised for on £40,000 a year. Someone to act as a change agent for up to £54,000, according to the Mail, while nurses are struggling to heat their homes and put food on the table.
Yeah, doesn't it sound awful? Now, there's only 4 paragraphs of this story we've got here, so there may be more inside where there's more detail that makes some more sense. But what we've got on the front page makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Now, the headline talks about millions, plural, being wasted on these woke jobs. The actual 4 paragraphs we can see talks about 1 million, singular. Now, if there are some very shonky figures knocking around for how much it would cost to give nurses their pay rise. And all the figures come from government and they've been criticised by fact-checking organisations. But roughly speaking, we think it would be about just under £10 billion to give the pay rise that's being asked for to NHS staff. Now, that wouldn't just be nurses, that's paramedics, midwives, physiotherapists, lots of different people under the Agenda for Change pay scale. Now, that's just under 10 billion, OK? And we've got £1 million here doing some other jobs. Now, 1 million out of that 10 billion that we need is 0.01%. It's meaningless. It's an absolute what? Why are we even talking about it? Now, you may want to say that it's silly to have something like a mindfulness lead helping people or nurses to meditate and they're paying them £40,000 a year. But this is one of those kind of jobs. The meditation is needed. It's a kind of one of those things that gets encouraged in failing organisations to try and retain staff who otherwise want to leave because they're mentally ill and under too much pressure. If you actually pay them properly and retain them and give them better working conditions, they don't need to damn well meditate, and you don't need to persuade them they ought to meditate with a £40,000 a year mindfulness lead. What you need to do is pay those nurses properly in the first place, give them, all the NHS staff, the conditions that they need to operate well so they're not mentally ill, and you won't need to spend the tiny amount of money that is being spent proportionately on these things that we can see in the front 4 paragraphs of the Daily Mail.
Yeah. Henry, tell us about this headline and whether you think it stands up to any scrutiny, but also broaden it out to where we are tonight when it comes to NHS nurses striking.
Yeah, so as far as we know, the NHS nurses and other medical professionals are talking about extending strike action if the government does not come to the table and negotiate with them about their current pay demands. Now, the government has shown so far no indication that it intends to back down. So that means more disruption going into January. Now, a bit more of this story is actually on the Daily Mail website. We've had a look, and essentially, you can always find some jobs which some of them might be pointless. I think a few more of them, the job descriptions probably have some slightly vacuous HR speak, but that doesn't necessarily mean that job is useless. But yeah, the sums involved as a share of the money that the NHS needs is minuscule. But I think the really interesting thing is there are some Conservative MPs quoted in the story complaining about these appointments and so on. But the thing that always missed whenever this story comes up, and it comes up with the NHS and other parts of the public sector all the time, civil service often, is that the reason that a lot of these DEI jobs exist, the diversity, equality and inclusion, is because of legislation which has been on mostly the Equality Act 2010, which has been on the statute book for the entire time the Conservatives have been in office, and they've not done anything about it. Right. So I think the question to ask Conservative MPs whenever they're complaining about these sorts of jobs is, well, if you really disapprove of them and you think they are diverting a relatively small amount, but if you think they are diverting funds away from the front line, why have you, the government, not done anything about this legislation in the 12 years that you've been in office? But yeah, fundamentally, you can find little irritating things. I'm sure in an organisation as big as the NHS, there will be money that's being badly spent. That's almost certain. But the fact is that the solution to these strikes and the bigger solution towards how we get an NHS that's fit for purpose, these are big structural decisions that involve a lot of money, and you're not going to fix them by playing whack-a-mole with stuff like this.
OK, there's a double-page spread in the Times. Unions pile on pressure to negotiate over pay. We'll move on from the strikes in a moment, Susie. Those figures you were talking about before, the government agrees with those figures, of course. It would cost around an additional £9.8 billion to give nurses the 19% pay rise they're asking for. That's 6.5% of the total NHS budget.
It's not just nurses. That is a massive chunk of NHS staff. It's everyone on the Agenda for Change pay deal. So it's not just nurses, though they tend to use it to say this is what it would cost to pay for the nurses' asks. No, it isn't.
Yeah. Steve Barclay today saying he urges the unions to reconsider. Still very firm in his opinion, but do you think his language is becoming a little bit more moderate? We know earlier in the week he described ambulance unions as making a conscious choice, didn't he, to inflict harm on patients. Do you think, is there a sign, do you think, that maybe we could see some movement before these next two strike dates by nurses?
No, I don't think there will be any movement before then, because the fundamental thing which those in power currently seem to have a problem with is history. And every pandemic, every wave of disease that has come across humanity has led to social change and increased rights and demands by the people who have survived the pandemic. So just taking it back for a moment to the 14th century for you, when the Black Death hit Europe in the early 1300s, it took a while for all the social change to come out of that because word travelled slowly. But in the 1380s, about 40 years later, we had the Peasants' Revolt. And that was led by the middle classes. It was an uprising against high taxation, unfair taxation, and also paying conditions, because the serfs, who were peasants who were attached to the land, were objecting or able. They were in demand elsewhere, and they could move their labour if they wanted to. They wanted to be paid better. So the middle classes and the peasants rose up, and they ended up actually dragging the Archbishop of Canterbury out of the Tower of London and decapitating him. All right, they destroyed every tax record in the UK. They sacked the Palace of Savoy, and they forced a boy king to say sorry and say he'd fix it all. Now, that happens, that kind of thing in different ways happens after every major new disease. And after this pandemic, we knew at the start that we could expect, on a much more escalated, quicker scale, because of the way our news travels now, for there to be massive social change as a result, and for there to be economic kickbacks, which would include people being more employable, more in demand, and requiring more money to be paid and having more rights. And this is how industrial action works. It is not some kind of foreign import. It's not Trotskyist. It's not some kind of weird thing the French do that we seem to have taken on or something like that. This is what English people have done for centuries when they have, when they're more in demand and when their circumstances change. It's to be expected, frankly. And the government needs to realise that what you have to do to get through that period is to come to the table, do a deal, negotiate. That's what it is. It's a deal.
That was a brilliant
And they're
history
not
lesson. You've covered hundreds of years of history in about 30 seconds then. Brilliant, brilliant. Henry, listen, we're
I'm
going to
gonna
move on
get
because I
tweeted
just want to
by
cover one more
medievalists
story.
now.
I want to do one more story before the break. Front page of the Eye. We know the Scottish Parliament voted for these reforms that lower the age for when people can apply to change their legal gender to 16 years, remove the need for medical diagnosis as well. The government in Westminster looking at this very closely.
Yeah, so basically what's happened is there's a devolution in the United Kingdom is very confusingly done. And the root of this dispute is that the aforementioned Equality Act, which I discussed in the last thing, is a reserved matter. Holyrood, the Scottish Parliament cannot legislate to affect the Equality Act, but the Gender Recognition Act is considered to be a devolved competence. So what the Scottish Parliament has done is it, as you say, it has changed the rules around getting a gender recognition certificate. It's now much easier and it can be done at a lower age. Now, the problem this creates is that suddenly a Scottish issued gender recognition certificate can be presented to authorities in England and Wales. That's prisons, that's schools, that's businesses, theoretically undermining the status of gender law in England and Wales. And so basically what the government is thinking of doing is that under the Scotland Act, under Section 35 of the Scotland Act, it can intervene to prevent bills passed by the Scottish Parliament from getting royal assent. Now, that would be hugely controversial. I don't think it's been done before, certainly not very often. And it would set up a clash, which the SNP would love, between Westminster and the Scottish Parliament over the right to legislate. But the dilemma for Westminster is that if they don't act, then you risk effectively creating a two-tier system where prisoners, students, and other people who have happened to get their GRC in Scotland have different rights, have an expedited pathway through the system compared to people in England and Wales.
Yeah, fascinating stuff, isn't it? And Sir Keir Starmer seems to support that Scottish legislation, according to the front of the Daily Telegraph. Thank you both for the moment. Plenty more still to come, including if you'd taken early retirement, could you be persuaded back into the workforce? Apparently, the government hopes so. Discussing that in a couple of minutes. Hello again, welcome back. Part two of the press preview. Susie and Henry still with us. Susie, front page of the Times, trying to get over 50s to come back to work.
Yeah, good luck with this, Rishi. Now, this is actually a re-announcement. This is something that was started in July, OK? The web page for this on the government website has been running since then. That was a pilot scheme, and they've now decided to kind of spin it as something fresh and new. But Boris Johnson did this. I think that was, oh my God, how many prime ministers ago? But it's only July. But it's been running for a while. But what they're not taking into account is midlife MOT, which is people who have stopped working, who have become economically inactive, in quote marks, which is silly because they're still spending money, aren't they, to buy things. But apparently they're economically inactive because they're not paying tax and they're not earning. They need to be given some kind of midlife MOT to give them some skills or see what skills they've got to bring them back into the workplace, according to this theory. And if you look in the copy there, it talks about tackling, and I quote, the notion that there is a problem with long-term unemployment rates and long-term sickness in this country. And that's not a notion. That's actually, it's a fact. 28% of people who were economically inactive since the pandemic have been mentally ill. Before the pandemic, it was 15%. There has been a jump in mental ill health, and that has been diagnosed by people. It's not imaginary, it's not a notion. You've also got people who have got long COVID. You have got people who, once they're over 50, they're more likely to become disabled, they're more likely to have diseases, they're more likely to have caring responsibilities, they're more likely to be grandparents, they're more likely to not be able to work for some reason. And they're also more likely to be expensive employees. Once a company gets rid of someone over 50, they can employ two people who are 25. So starting saying they should all come back into the workplace is a marvellous idea, but are the over 50s going to pick fruit?
Yeah.
Are they going to drive lorries? And are they going to run the NHS?
Henry?
So obviously anything that if there are people who are older and would like to work but are facing barriers to get into work, then a program to help those people is great. What I don't think we've seen from the government so far is much of an evidence base for how many people that actually is. We know roughly how many people they're counting as, economically inactive because they're over a certain age but not working. But I don't think we've yet got a breakdown of, how many of these people are we actually trying to help? And I think that some people in the Conservative Party will also be slightly concerned that this is a very sort of treasury brain view in which every single person is viewed purely through the lens of, are they working? Good, that's a policy success. Are they not working for whatever reason? Bad, that's a policy failure. As I said, some people have caring responsibilities. Now, that means that if you take them back into the economy, back into employment, that means that you need to find more carers from somewhere to pick up the slack. That also means that people who are, for example, stay-at-home parents, if they go back, you need to find more care for them. Care is extremely expensive and in short supply. So, yes, this is a well-intentioned scheme. And if the government has evidence that there is a substantial number of people who fit what I think are a quite narrow range of criteria, that's great, and it should be fully supported. But I think there are two problems with it. One, an awful lot of people who show up on the dashboard as economically inactive probably have very good reasons for being so. And two, if you bring some of those people back into the workforce, there's a bit of a waterbed effect and you create pressure elsewhere.
OK. And let's just finish. We've just got about 30 seconds, Susie. It's the same story in the front of the Daily Express. King's vow to build on Queen's legacy in Christmas speech, and the front of the Mirror, always close to Mama. The King is going to deliver his speech from St George's Chapel in Windsor.
Yes, as close as he could get to his mother, which may be sweet for some people and a bit gruesome for others. We're going to have to wait and see, of course, entirely of what he said. But it's the first time he's going to do it. And, of course, this does show that at the age of 73, it is possible to finally get a job.
Henry, one sentence?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably very weird for most of us to be saying the King after having grown up all our lives saying the Queen. God knows what it must be like for him. Good luck.
OK. Thank you both very much indeed. King Charles will pledge to build on the glorious legacy of his darling Mama, according to the Daily Express.